welcome back to my channel, True Crime and Trials, and today I will be carrying on with the Robert Durst trial. I know it's been a while, but with the COVID virus and everything, it's taken me a while just to get back into it, and to be honest, the last couple of days they did before they stopped the trials, it's been audio only, so it's really hard to just sit and listen without having something to look at. But I've done day 5, so I'm going to crack on with that. So the first witness was Marvin Karp, and he was a doctor back in 2000 in Beverly Hills. He was Susan's neighbour, but he didn't know her personally. And the attorney shows him a picture of Susan so he can formally identify Susan in front of the court. He didn't socialise with Susan, but had been in her house 3 or 4 times. He thinks prior to her death, but can't be sure. He never had a discussion with her, but would occasionally see her in the backyard with her dogs. He could hear them barking inside the house, which he said was annoying at times. He first saw on the Saturday morning, 23rd of December 2000, 2 dogs running around at the front of his property, and he realised they were Susan's dogs and he'd never seen them running around before, especially outside the house. One of them ran out into the street, which worried him. He almost went to her house, but he saw them run back to the house, so he didn't do anything else. He said it was early-ish in the morning, maybe 9:30, but it could have been either of those. He did not see Susan at all that morning and had never seen her dogs loose before. So the cross-examination, he could not see all of Susan's backyard, just portions of it, and he couldn't see the back door from his house. He did not hear anything unusual from Susan's house, no gunshots or yelling. He doesn't remember seeing any leashes on the dogs, because previously people said they saw leashes on them. He spoke to a detective first on the Sunday and then was contacted at a later date by the police. A time later, he was talked to again and again before the trial, but he can't remember exact time and dates. The attorney asked Marvin if he knows someone by the name of Dee Baskin. He does know who she is, but he doesn't recall being asked any questions about her. She owned the house Susan was living in and the house Marvin lived in. He doesn't remember being asked if Susan may have had some issues with Dee. So the prosecution goes in for the redirect. He didn't have any interactions with Dee, and he says she was nice and pleasant. He doesn't remember speaking to detectives in January of 2001. He says he was honest with them, but the events were clearer then than they are now, obviously. I mean, it's 9 years ago. He is asked if he remembers saying that the dogs had leashes on, but he is convinced they didn't have leashes on. So, yeah. The second witness is Sandra Garfield. Sandra is a psychoanalyst in Beverly Hills on Benedict Canyon. She did not know Susan Berman and had never met her. Excuse me. She remembers learning that Susan had been killed in December of 2000 and she was visited by law enforcement. She doesn't remember the date, but her guess is 23rd of December. But again, her memory of what happened so long ago isn't as clear now as it was then. She said a dog wandered into her house as she had left the door open, and the dog's name was Lulu. It was a small dog, and she says the dog was wearing a leash. See, it's just conflicting statements, but I think more people say that the dog had leashes on than said they didn't. There was no owner with the dog and no one came for the dog. A phone number was on the dog tag and she called and left a message to say she had found their dog. They play the message Sandra had left for Susan and she had called a couple of times. The audio for this message is terrible, so I couldn't really hear anything that was said when this voicemail was played. I mean, the audio for the whole thing isn't fantastic, so when they play voicemail messages and things, it's just impossible to hear anything. She gave the dog some food and noticed what she thought was blood on the dog's paws. Sandra did not go to the house that she can remember, even though in one of the voicemails she said she had left a note. But it turns out she had in fact left a note, but she doesn't remember. They're constantly having to remind these witnesses about the statements that they'd given prior. And I get, that they're having a hard time remembering what they actually said back then. So it's a bit frustrating when the prosecution know what they've said previously, but the witnesses can't remember anything. So they keep implying that they did actually say this, but 9 times out of 10 they'll say, well, I can't actually remember. She said the dog slept at her house and had scratched the carpet trying to get out of the room they had put it in. Obviously, it was trying to get back home. The next day, she decided she would try and return the dog to the address that was on the dog tag. She went with her husband and her son. She could see other dogs in the house, and she said they were jumping around and barking. She felt like something was very wrong, and they went to the neighbours and told them about the dog they had and asked them if they would take the dog in and return it back to Susan, and they agreed. Sandra has never seen a dog loose on her street before. The cross-examination, Sandra doesn't dispute that she left a note, she just doesn't recall she did. So the next witness is Catherine Shaw Cutter. Catherine and her husband lived on Benedict Canyon. Her husband, before they were married, had lived there for about 2 years before Catherine moved in, after they got married. Catherine was a freelance writer, so she spent a significant amount of time at home. She says it is quite secluded and safe where they lived on Benedict Canyon. She wasn't aware of any crime in that area. She says it wasn't safe for young kids and pets due to the abundant wildlife there, such as mountain lions, coyotes and snakes, etc. So they had to be kept indoors. Catherine knew Susan as she was her next door neighbour. And Catherine was the neighbour that Sandra left Lulu with. She would chat with Susan and said she loved to talk. She was funny but very private and didn't like people just walking up to her house. She didn't, obviously, as we've heard prior, she didn't like to answer the door to people that hadn't called previously to say they were going. Catherine didn't socialise with Susan and never went into her home. Catherine never saw Susan outside of the house with the dogs. She says Susan doted on her dogs and she spoke to them like they were her children. Catherine didn't socialise with... Oh, I've read that bit, sorry. On the 24th of December 2000, Sandra came to her house with Susan's dog. Catherine took the dog out to her backyard and noticed that Susan's back door was open, which she thought was strange, and she heard the other dogs barking. Her husband went and knocked on Susan's door, but there was no answer. Because things didn't add up for Catherine, she called the police. Catherine was concerned for Susan because she could have had a fall or something. She had no idea she was dead. They now play the 911 call, and obviously the audio again is a problem. The cross-examination, Catherine didn't hear any sounds of a struggle or a gunshot. Catherine says Dee Baskin was domineering and a tough customer, who is the landlady for the houses that these people lived in. So I'm presuming that this Dee Baskin may crop up at some point. I don't know if she's going to be a witness. So we shall see where that goes. The next witness is Anne Anderson Doyle. and her and her husband lived in the same apartment block next to each other, which is where I think it's the one in New York. Anne didn't have much to do with Robert. Anne says Kathy was, so this is going back to when Robert and Kathy were together. Anne says Kathy was a beautiful woman and wished she had got to know her under better circumstances. She would only ever see Kathy when she had to get away from Robert. So I think they lived on the same floor, practically next door to each other. Kathy would be upset and emotionally rattled. She would be unsure of herself and felt attacked and undermined. Other times she would be crying, her hair would be dishevelled, and she would be shaking. When Kathy would go around to Anne's apartment, Anne would just try and calm her down. Kathy told her that she was trying to escape from an emotionally abusive relationship. She was afraid. Kathy didn't want Robert to see where she was. Robert would call Kathy names, demean her, not support her. He called her a skank and that she wasn't good enough and she was a nobody. Kathy would tell her that Robert had been physically violent towards her. Now, as I said before, the trouble with this is the witnesses are struggling to remember events and information from what happened back then. So the attorneys are struggling to jog the witnesses' memories without leading them to answers and to, giving information to trigger the memories. So they're really struggling to get information out there about what happened. So again, they play an interview between the prosecution attorney and Anne, which again is inaudible, but it's being played to jog her memory. So now her memory has been refreshed a little. She can't remember exactly how many times Kathy went to Anne's apartment due to physical abuse. The one thing she does know is that Kathy was terrified of Robert. In September or October of 1981, Kathy came to Anne's apartment and it was late. Kathy was shaking and crying. Anne's apartment had a lot of windows and Kathy didn't want to be seen, and the only room that didn't have a lot of windows was the bathroom. So Anne would take Kathy into the bathroom and they would sit in there. They sat in there for a couple of hours as Anne tried to calm her down. Kathy was completely terrified. She said she was scared of her husband, Robert. Anne said Kathy told her that Robert had made lots of threats to her, particularly about a document that Robert wanted Kathy to sign. This document was to make sure that if they divorced, Kathy would get nothing, and Kathy refused to sign it. And the prosecution are trying really, really hard to get the witness to remember what they had previously said. And this witness seems to be saying everything but what they want her to say. Anne still thinks about what happened and wishes she could have done more. Anne can't remember verbatim what was said that night, as it was 38 years ago. Anne doesn't remember anything about a gun, and Anne never saw Kathy after she disappeared, and Bob never asked Anne if she had seen Kathy. So the cross-examination, Anne doesn't recall the Dursts having a dog, bearing in mind she did live next door. Anne never saw the document that Kathy and Bob had a fight about that night. Whenever Anne saw Kathy, it was never in the morning, but possibly through the day. She can't really remember, but definitely knows she never saw her in the morning. She never saw any bruises or blood on Kathy the night of the big argument. She just looked dishevelled, like she had been pushed around a bit. So I can't really tell whose favour this is going in, because obviously the prosecution is having a hard time about getting the witnesses to remember anything. So that's working in the defence's favour, in my opinion. So next we're on to Tomas Durst, who is the brother of Robert. And Tomas starts by saying he hates that he is in court today and he didn't come voluntarily, and he tried everything he could to not be there. He avoided it because he's humiliated to be in court and he's fearful of his brother. There's a 7-year age difference between him and Robert, and Tomas is younger than Robert. Robert treated Tomas as if he didn't belong in the family and there was no warmth between them. Robert did try to get closer with Tomas when they got older, but it didn't last. I mean, Robert just sounds like such a weird man. Tomas didn't have any relationships with his siblings. This happened when their father died, when, according to Tomas, they all realised they had nothing in common and Tomas went his separate way. Tomas never knew Robert to be generous with money. Now, this is a running theme throughout this trial, how tight Robert is with his money. Tomas says Kathy was an ambitious, caring and loving person, extremely intelligent and hard-working. Tomas says Bob made demands on Kathy that she had to follow and that she was in an inferior position. I mean, it's corroborating what the other witnesses have said about Robert and Kathy's relationship. It was all one-sided. Bob and Kathy went to San Francisco and stayed with Tomas, and he observed that Bob never showed any love or appreciation towards Kathy. While Bob and Kathy stayed with Tomas, they had an argument which made Tomas uncomfortable. Kathy came out of the bedroom and said to Tomas, "Is there any way out?" Tomas led her out of the house. He says she was upset. He took her through the basement and offered her money, which she wouldn't take. Tomas wasn't concerned that she was in any danger. He just thought she was unhappy. He says there was no response from Bob when this had happened. He didn't ask where she was or anything. She was gone for a few hours and then came back. Bob and Kathy left a day or so after that argument. Tomas did visit Bob and Kathy in their apartment in New York. Kathy opened the door and Tomas said she was in a very sexy nightgown. It was flimsy and Tomas thought he was in the wrong building and he shouldn't be here. Bob then came up behind Kathy and lifted up her nightgown and she shouted, "Robert!" And he did it again, so Tomas turned around and left. So weird. He said Bob seemed to enjoy it. It was a power trip to Bob. He said Kathy didn't like it and looked uncomfortable. Why? What kind of hold did Bob have over Kathy? It's just mind-blowing. Tomas then visited Kathy on her own and she was very upset and talking very rapidly. Kathy told Tomas that she wanted and intended to divorce Bob, but she was afraid that Bob would sue her for abandonment and cut her off completely from any money he would owe her from the marriage. I'm sorry, but I'd have been gone, money or not. Tomas gave her money because he knew she didn't have any money, as Bob would only give her food stamps. When Tomas gave her some money, she said she needed thousands more. Tomas got up because he didn't want to cause any trouble with Bob. He was afraid Bob would get violent with him. So obviously, I mean, Tomas wanted to help her, but he didn't want to get in too deep. He had already had a confrontation with Bob in 1982 when Kathy was missing. Bob said that he knew Kathy had asked Tomas for money in a very aggressive way. He shouted at Tomas, Tomas literally shouted this in court, saying, "I know she asked you for money." I mean, he really shouted loud. Tomas then said because Bob was so angry, he thought he was about to die. There was one incident where Tomas, Bob and their dad were going to the family business building and Tomas went into the revolving door. Bob from behind pushed the door and made it go round and around really quick and Tomas went flying into the street. He said Bob was laughing like it was the funniest thing he had ever seen, and you could tell this event had stayed with Tomas since it happened. He seemed so upset and angry about this, and I think this just goes to show more of Bob's character and the type of person he is. So then Thomas found out from their sister that Kathy had disappeared. Then we move on to Susan Berman. Thomas had met Susan Berman once in 1975 in San Francisco. He said Susan treated Bob like a newborn baby and it was obvious she loved Bob. Thomas never saw her again after that. Thomas found out Susan had been murdered in the newspaper. The last time Thomas spoke to Bob was in 1990, and that was the last time. And the last time he saw him was in 1986. Appearing in court in front of Bob has been very difficult for him. I can imagine it can't be easy. So, the cross-examination. Thomas knows nothing about how his mother died. Remember that Bob saw his mother falling off the roof. Thomas's father, Seymour, was a very distant father and barely spent any time with them. Kathy would often call Thomas late at night asking if he knew where Bob was. Thomas believed that Kathy was using some sort of drug. The defence attorney is obviously trying to get Thomas to say that he thought Kathy was high on cocaine, and I thought from listening to it that the defence attorney was leading Thomas to say a lot of things about Kathy. And the defence then asks Thomas what the price of cocaine was back then. I mean, what? Thomas doesn't remember telling investigators back then that he thought Kathy was using cocaine. The defence then asks if they show him a document, will it refresh his memory? Thomas says he really can't remember what he said, and he's quite snippish and forceful with his answers at this point. I think he just wants to get it done and over with. Thomas says he never saw Kathy taking cocaine, but even if he thought he's been shown that he mentioned something about Kathy taking cocaine, he still really doesn't remember, and he stands by that. So we are on to the next witness, which is James Varian, and this is a video recording. And again, the audio is awful, but James Varian is a detective. He was involved in the disappearance of Kathy, and he was asked to interview the neighbours. James doesn't have full and complete memory about the case, but he did have a chance to review it. James is reading out his report from the day he interviewed the neighbours, specifically the Doyles, where Kathy had climbed out of her bedroom window and beat on the Doyles' window to let her in, and told them that Bob had beat her and that he was going to kill her. He does remember this interview, but doesn't remember the other neighbours he interviewed, and James has never met Bob in person. So there we go, end of day 5. I think, you've seen a bit of the Durst family dynamic between one of the brothers so far, and more about Robert's character and how strange and weird. I seriously can't think of any more words to describe this guy. So yeah, I will see what day 6 brings. So until then, bye for now.